As the director of the Swedish National Human Rights Institution, it is a great honor to introduce our distinguished guest today, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights Defender, Mary Lawlor. Human rights defenders are people who often at great personal risk stand up for the rights and dignity of others. They document abuses, support victims, challenge injustice, and keep the promise of human rights alive in practice, not just in words. Yet across the world, these individuals face intimidation, harassment, criminalization, and even violence for their work. Protecting those who protect others is therefore not only a moral responsibility, it is essential to the health of democracy and the rule of law. Mary Lawlor has dedicated her entire professional life to this cause. She has been engaged in human rights work for decades and more than 20 years of experience working directly with human rights defenders at risk across the globe. As UN Special Rapporteur, Mary Lawlor is an independent expert appointed by the UN Human Rights Council. Her role is to monitor the situation of human rights defenders worldwide, engage in dialogue with governments, raise alarm when defenders are at risk, and issue recommendations on how states can better fulfill their obligations to protect those who speak out. She conducts country visits, reports to the United Nations, and gives a voice at a global level to individuals and movements that are too often silenced. What makes Mary Lawlor's voice particularly powerful is the combination of deep field experience, strong moral clarity, and an unwavering focus on practical protection. She consistently reminds us that human rights are not defended in conference rooms alone. They are defended on the ground by real people in real danger every day. So we are truly fortunate to have you with us here today. Please join me now in giving a very warm welcome to the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, Mary Lawlor. The floor is yours.
So, first of all, I want to thank the Swedish Institute for Human Rights for inviting me here today. I was delighted to come. I came from Doha yesterday and going back tonight, and I've done 8 trips since October, so I'm very happy to be in my own bed for Christmas. So my mandate is the protection of human rights defenders, and anyone can be a human rights defender. People of any gender, of varying ages, from any part of the world, and from all sorts of professional or other backgrounds. Human rights defenders uphold the universality of human rights and act in accordance with the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, which says that anyone or any organization can promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms. This was adopted by consensus at the UN in 1998, and human rights defenders help realize the rights articulated in the Declaration. Human rights defenders in Yemen, in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in Myanmar, in Ukraine, in Haiti, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and many other places are being killed with impunity and attacked. This is happening because they are documenting human rights violations, delivering humanitarian assistance to the civilian population, or providing services to traumatized women and girls who have been subject to gender-based violence. In Gaza, human rights defenders are in the same catastrophic situation as everyone else there. They have absolutely no protection and the risks are extreme. One recently told me, "We are all on death row in Gaza." Many human rights defenders have been killed by Israel already, and that is the risk they still face despite the ceasefire. And despite some very limited improvement and a reduction in the scale of attacks, their work remains critical and dreadfully dangerous. That a situation which appears to have reached the threshold of genocide could have been permitted to last for so long in full view of the world further undermines the legitimacy of the rules-based international order and leaves us with a system that is creaking under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Numerous human rights defenders have expressed disgust with this. One from Algeria recently said, "When grave violations are met with silence, double standards, or political compromise, defenders begin to question whether the principle of universality and accountability truly apply to all." This credibility crisis has been exacerbated by massive cuts in funding in the field of human rights. The countries which have spoken about most and spent most on developing a supranational human rights architecture and infrastructure are now abandoning or deprioritizing it, choosing instead to direct resources into weapons, security, and defense. The current US administration has led the way in this with the huge reductions in US aid that impact most negatively, as it always does, on women, LGBTI persons, and minorities. But it is not just the US that is turning away from human rights funding. The UK, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Switzerland, and of course Sweden have all announced reductions in their overseas development assistance budgets. This deprioritization is happening at a time when rights in every region of the world are being rolled back as governments seek to limit the potential of citizens to pursue accountability and uphold justice. We are seeing renewed attacks on the rights of women, of LGBTI persons and minorities, on climate activists and student protesters, while at the international level, the language used to articulate human rights is being majorly challenged by countries like Russia, China, and the US in an apparent attempt to erase some of the progress on the rights of those who are most at risk. Restrictive legislation continues to bounce from country to country, designed to hamstring human rights defenders. Draft NGO laws are giving governments extensive oversight on the activities of non-profit organizations, and it continues to be introduced, including most recently in Rwanda, in Zambia, in Paraguay, in Venezuela, and in Tunisia. The adoption of the so-called foreign agent laws or attempts to introduce such legislation, as has happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Hungary, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Slovakia, and Serbia, place additional burdens on human rights defenders and organizations, requiring those which received funding from abroad, a right protected in the 1998 Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, to register or label themselves as agents of foreign influence, as if human rights are a foreign concept. National security or counter-terror legislation are widely used to arrest those active in the defense of human rights. There is an ever-growing tendency for governments to conflate the promotion and protection of human rights of minority communities with terrorism. The growing serious restrictions on the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of expression across the world, be it in relation to pride marches anti-corruption issues, or the fight for social justice and the protection of the environment are also extremely worrisome. In my latest report to the UN General Assembly, focusing on human rights defenders working on climate change, I highlighted a growing trend of activists involved in non-violent environmental protests being criminalized. Young activists are often at the forefront of these movements, but rarely receive adequate support. They are targeted through disgraceful slaps by companies with a stake in continuing fossil fuel extraction or hoping to benefit from the transfer of the neo-colonial extractive template onto the energy transition. Those engaged on climate change and environmental issues are also being subjected to physical attacks, to threats, to surveillance, and police violence during peaceful protests. These attacks are spreading as the climate situation becomes ever more urgent. It is creating a vicious cycle, leaving the climate crisis unaddressed. Human rights at risk, and human rights defenders deterred from speaking out and taking action, and this is happening all over the world. Crackdowns on peaceful pro-Palestinian protests, led by students on university campuses, and other restrictions on Palestinian solidarity have also been widespread. Such protests have been taking place in many countries, including Germany, the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, Belgium, France, to name a few. States must support, not suppress, actions aiming to stop war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. Unnecessary and excessive police violence or unjust criminalization for exercising fundamental freedoms can never be justified. Additionally, I see a reluctance in receiving human rights defenders for temporary relocation and rest and respite, including in EU countries, effectively erasing their chances of escaping when the risks are extremely high or when they are just burnt out and need a rest. And this happens also here in Sweden regarding visas. Defenders tell me they don't want to use the asylum route. They only need some time to get temporary protection and return to their countries to continue their activism. And I know this, human rights defenders want to build civil and just societies in their own countries. They want to contribute to change there. And it's in their blood and their breathing to do human rights work. And the EU needs to make sure that such temporary relocation avenues remain a possibility. National human rights institutions are under attack as well, due to budget and resource cuts, intimidation of their staff and leadership, and other forms of pressure that can negatively impact their work and independence. Coordinated smear campaigns against them are an example of this. And this has happened in Sweden too. I was very disturbed to hear that the development minister publicly alleged in October that SIDA money was going to the Palestinian Independent Commission for Human Rights, and I quote, which has links to Hamas and Islamic Jihad. The Independent Commission has grade A status under the Paris Principles. No country is fully immune to these global trends. Together with other special procedures mandate holders, I have continuously raised the targeting and growing restrictions on civic space and the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association and freedom of expression of human rights defenders all around the world. As I survey the state of human rights and the international human rights system today, I see an undeniable disillusionment with the international human rights architecture as it currently exists. It has proven largely incapable of protecting those people who are most at risk, including civilians in wars, refugees, and human rights defenders exposing abuses. The proliferation of armed conflict around the world feeds into this disillusionment. Because I started this work in the 1970s, I tend to take the long view when considering the current context. And my experience has taught me that the development of human rights is not linear, that there are peaks and troughs, and that if you look at each of the last decades since the 70s, they have all had their own human rights catastrophes. It is undeniable that we are in one of those troughs now, where deadly conflict, double standards, democratic decline, and funding deficits are combining to pose a question on whether we are entering into an anti-rights era, whether the protections put in place over the last 50 years risk being torn down. This was clearly on the mind of the Secretary General last week, or when he warned last year, that we, and I quote, "we cannot accept a world in which grandmothers fear their granddaughters will enjoy fewer rights than they had." When confronted with this type of question, I think about the thousands of human rights defenders I have had the good fortune to meet over the years from all corners of the world, and about their resilience that they have shown in the face of grave injustice. I think that no matter how strong this current pushback on human rights is, it will not be successful in breaking their spirit, even in the face of desperation and danger. Human rights defenders have a profound understanding of how human rights are woven into and inseparable from daily living, not in the gift of government to give, but in the entitlement of a people to claim. I return to the human rights defenders who have achieved, I return to what human rights defenders have achieved since the adoption of the UN Declaration of Human Rights Defenders in 1998, and continually find a sense of renewal. And it reminds me why, for all of us, this fight is worth fighting. My report to the Human Rights Council in 2023 to mark the 25th anniversary of the Human Rights Defenders Declaration was full of success stories of how human rights defenders have contributed to fairer, more equal, and more just societies, often putting themselves at risk to help realize rights for others. And this ranged from a children's organisation in Bangladesh who worked with the local commissioner and succeeded in stopping over a dozen forced marriages, to a group in Yemen, the Abductee Mothers, who worked with both sides of the conflict and earned the trust of both sides in an effort to discover where their loved ones were, so that they could find their brothers, their husbands, their sons, and if they were dead, know that, and if they were buried somewhere, have a grave to mourn on. I think of the progress in my own country, Ireland, driven by human rights defenders and civil society in legalising equal marriage and greater reproductive rights for women, all in the last decade. Yes, the international system designed to protect and promote rights is badly damaged. But regardless of whether a system exists or not, I know that human rights defenders will continue their work at local levels, even in the most difficult of contexts. They defend rights because they believe it is the right thing to do. And they believe in the promise of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 1, which says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. While some may no longer hold faith in the system, they hold true to the values embodied in the Declaration. It is their tenacity, their persistence, that gives me hope in such uncertain times. Human rights are fundamental to us all, as the air that we breathe. And human rights defenders should be seen as physicians and scientists, ensuring that this air is clean and safe for us to inhale. Just like air, without human rights, we suffocate. Thank you very much. Oh, God. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions or reflections?
Or comments, or advice.
Thank you so much for a fantastic speech and a lot of hope for us. My name is Britte Sedman and I work for the Swedish Institute for Human Rights. I wanted to ask if you have, if you could elaborate a little bit about media's role in smearing human rights defenders.
Media,
yeah.
Yeah, it's a trend we see all over the world. We see media being captured by powerful interests that are aligned to oppressive or corrupt or basically thuggish governments. And as well as that, you have the scourge of social media and the bots that are promoting far-right hate and smearing of anyone who is involved in defending the right to defend human rights, you know. And it is something that nobody has really grappled with. And for me, I was at a session in Doha over the weekend, and I thought it was very interesting about how artificial intelligence is being used to feed the algorithms into the brains of anyone who is basically, you know, brainwashing anyone who has, I suppose, followed some of these anti-rights views that you see so often on social media. And I think that's very dangerous. There really should be kind of critical thinking education in the schools and human rights education. From my point of view, I would love to see human rights education starting from a very young age as a compulsory subject and one which is examinable when it comes to the second level, because we need to really start developing a culture of human rights again, I think, in the world, and also to try and combat the capture by the media and by social media in smearing and spreading misinformation and disinformation.
Hello. I'm Åsa. I am CEO of Save the Children in Sweden. Thank you so much for talking to us at 8 o'clock in the morning here. We're very grateful for that, and very alarming, but also at least it gives me hope to know that people like yourselves are traveling the world to talk about these issues. You said that you think that human rights defenders will prevail despite all the difficulties. I would like to hope so too. They are the ones that have given us the liberties that we have, because they have always pushed politicians in and proposed legislation and so on. I am particularly worried, though, I have to say, about women's organizations and girls' organizations in particular, because they were so underfunded already before this last year's madness and pushback. So do you see any signs of hope there? Because I do think that some of the best might actually not survive because they were some of the best women's rights and girls' rights organizations in particular, because they're always seen as so political, and they were already before. So do you see any signs, any hope that you have for us that they will actually survive despite the funding problems? Thank you.
Well, you know, when I started, it was the 70s and there was no funding. And human rights defenders weren't recognized as people who defend human rights. You know, there were dissidents, all right, but there was a balance between professionalizing the organization and doing more volunteers. I was director of Amnesty. I was chair of Amnesty at the time. We had no staff, it was all voluntary. And, you know, you had to fundraise. You couldn't rely on governments or foundations. So I used to have wine and cheeses, which were extremely popular. I get all the wine for free. I go round all the pubs, one after the other, get a bottle of wine from each pub, and get the cheese for free from cheesemakers, get somebody in who knew about wine to grade the wine. We'd start with the good stuff, we'd move on to the medium stuff, and by the time we got to the absolute plonk, nobody would know the difference. But I'm only saying that just to say I know Sierra Leone Amnesty branch was just starting off, and they used to have football matches. My next report to the Human Rights Council is trying to bring the voices of human rights defenders back to the council. And the first part is the motivation and spirit, because I think it's really important to bring that. And we got over 300 submissions, including some from Sweden, to that when we did the call for proposal for information. And the second part is the impact of the cuts on the work of human rights defenders and what they are doing to try and mitigate it. So, you know, when you're up against the wall and you really want to do the work, you find other ways. So, for example, a lawyer in the Philippines who is working for a woman human rights organization who has no job anymore because the funding has all been cut. What she is doing is she is doing work from America for some people in America, some firm in America, on a consultancy basis part-time. And that gives her enough money to live on and to do her work for the Filipino organization. That's just an example. There was a woman psychologist. I can't remember, I think it was Venezuela. But what she was doing was she set up basically a fake organization so she could work on women's rights. She pretended that it was about empowering women and training women on kind of allowable stuff. But it was really, and she was getting all sorts of funding from companies to do this. And so she was continuing to do her work, but in secret. And then there was another organization, I think Angelica and myself, we went to. Angelica works with me and is a huge help to me. And without her, I would be floundering. In fact, I flounder most of the time, but not when I have somebody like Angelica around me. So we went to, do you remember, it was the LGBTI, was that in Bosnia or Georgia? I think it was Georgia, actually. And she was a doctor. And she was a GP, and she did a certain limited amount of hours. And that work funded her work to do LGBTI work in Georgia. So I think when you're asking me, I think people will adapt over time, and the tide will turn again. But in the meantime, of course, it has had huge effects. And as always, as you rightly said, it is always women's organizations, LGBTI organizations, minority organizations, and organizations of people who are so poor that their voices are never heard. So but, you know, I think that, I don't know if you know the Women's Coalition on Human Rights Defenders. Well, you know, I think they're a good example of how collaboration between the women human rights defenders, NGOs, and learning from each other and strategizing it went down, like, it was really good when it started for a few years, and then it went kaput. But now it has arisen again from the ashes. And I think that, you know, that's why I say that human rights defenders will always find way to do their works, be they women's organizations or any other kind of organization.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, the time is over, but we thank you again very much, Mary Lawlor.